You don't struggle because life is hard, you struggle because you keep resetting yourself at the exact moment change is supposed to begin. Every time something important shows up, you don't reject it. You delay it in a softer way so you don't feel guilty about avoiding it. That is the pattern you repeat so often that you've stopped noticing it. You sit with clear intentions, but unclear execution. And then you act surprised when nothing changes. Look closely at your days, not the highlighted parts, but the invisible ones. The moments where you said later without even thinking. The moments where you chose something easier and told yourself it doesn't matter this time. That this time is the reason nothing accumulates. There is a version of you that already knows what needs to be done. It is not confused. It is not lost. It is just repeatedly ignored. And the real problem is not that you fail, it is that you return to the same starting point emotionally every day, as if yesterday had no cost. That reset feeling is the real barrier. Not lack of knowledge. Not lack of opportunity. Just the constant return to comfort after every small moment of resistance. So your life doesn't move forward in a straight line. It moves in circles that feel productive while quietly staying in the same place. And the longer you repeat that cycle, the more normal it starts to feel, until staying stuck feels like your natural state. Now be honest with yourself in a way you usually avoid. What you're experiencing isn't randomness. It's a repeatable internal system that runs before you even notice a decision is being made. And it always follows the same structure. 1. Self-deception layer. You don't directly avoid responsibility. You rewrite it. Not in obvious lies, but in acceptable language, I'll do it later. I need the right mindset. I'll start fresh tomorrow. Each sentence reduces urgency without triggering guilt. That's why it works so well, it feels reasonable while quietly removing action. 2. Avoidance loop. Once delay becomes normal, your brain starts associating discomfort with escape. So the moment something requires effort, your attention automatically shifts elsewhere. Not because you consciously choose it, but because your system has been trained to exit pressure quickly. This is where most people lose control, not in big failures, but in micro exits from discomfort. 3. Emotional negotiation. Before action, there is always an internal vote. Do I feel like doing this right now? If the answer is no, the task is not rejected, it is postponed. Over time, this creates a hidden rule: action must be emotionally approved first. And that rule quietly replaces discipline. 4. Discipline failure cycle. Combine all three. Self-deception justifies delay, avoidance reduces discomfort, emotion decides timing. And you get a system that feels flexible but produces the same outcome: stagnation. Nothing dramatic. No collapse. Just repetition. A simple real-life example: you plan to work on something important, study, skill-building, work project. You sit down, but instead of starting, you prepare first. You check messages. You adjust your setup. You organize things that don't need organizing. It looks like getting ready, but it is actually avoidance with structure. And because nothing feels obviously wrong in the moment, you don't interrupt it. That's the danger. The system doesn't feel like failure. It feels like a normal day. So the real question is not whether you know what to do. It's whether you can see the system operating while it's happening, not after. 1. Why starting again never works. You don't actually struggle with starting. You struggle with continuity. Most people think the problem is that they stop. But the deeper issue is that every time they restart, they reset their identity back to zero. So nothing accumulates. You work for a few days, break the rhythm, then come back with the mindset of someone who is beginning again, not continuing something already in motion. That shift destroys momentum more than the break itself. Because progress is not built through isolated effort. It is built through uninterrupted direction. And every reset quietly erases that direction. This is why your life feels repetitive even when you try again. You are not building on previous effort, you are replacing it with a new attempt that has no connection to the last one. There is a subtle psychological truth here. The mind prefers restarting over repairing. Restarting feels clean. Repairing feels uncomfortable. But only one of them builds anything real. A grounded example, you decide to improve your routine. For a few days, you follow it. Then something interrupts you, a busy day, low energy, distraction. Instead of adjusting and continuing, you abandon it and promise to restart properly later. That later becomes a reset point, not a continuation point. And each reset weakens your identity as someone who follows through. Not because you failed, but because you keep restarting the version of yourself that was already in progress. Jim Rohn captured this principle simply: success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines, practiced every day. The key word is every day, not occasionally, not when motivated, not when conditions are perfect. Here is the interruption you need to see clearly. Every restart is not progress. It is resistance disguised as intention. And until you stop resetting yourself emotionally, nothing you build will survive long enough to compound. Now ask yourself, are you building consistency or just collecting attempts? Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? 2. The hidden cost of small delays. Most people assume big change requires big effort. But in reality, most stagnation is created by small delays repeated often enough to become identity. You don't lose your direction in one decision. You lose it in hundreds of minor postponements that feel harmless individually. Each delay feels like nothing. But together, they form a pattern of hesitation that becomes your default response to effort. And that default quietly decides your future. Here's what's important to understand: delay is not neutral. It always has direction. It either strengthens action or strengthens avoidance. There is no in-between. A simple scenario: you plan to do something meaningful, work, study, fitness, a personal goal. You feel resistance. Instead of starting, you delay it by a few minutes. Then those minutes expand. Not dramatically, just enough to shift your mental state. And once your state shifts, your original intention loses clarity. So you don't cancel the task. You dilute it. This dilution is what creates long-term inconsistency. Because your brain learns one pattern: effort can be postponed without consequence. And once that belief forms, resistance no longer feels like something to overcome, it feels like something to wait out. Over time, this changes how you relate to responsibility itself. You stop seeing it as something immediate and start treating it as something flexible. That flexibility is where discipline collapses quietly. Not through rebellion, through softness. And softness repeated enough becomes identity. Now the uncomfortable insight. Your life is not shaped by what you failed to do once. It is shaped by what you consistently delay without noticing. And if you examine your daily behavior honestly, you will see that most of your time issues are actually delay patterns disguised as normal routine. So the question becomes sharper. Are you delayed by circumstances or trained by repetition? Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? 3. Identity doesn't reflect behavior, it follows it. Most people think identity comes first. I am disciplined, so I act disciplined. But the actual structure works in reverse. Behavior comes first. Identity follows. You don't act according to who you are, you become who you repeatedly act like. And this is where the problem locks in. Because once a behavior repeats enough times, your mind stops treating it as a choice and starts treating it as definition. That is when discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like not me. A simple example: if someone repeatedly avoids difficult tasks, they don't just form a habit, they form a self-concept: I don't handle pressure well. That sentence doesn't appear suddenly. It is built quietly through repetition. And once it forms, it begins to filter future behavior. You stop even attempting certain things because they no longer match the identity you have already accepted. This is the invisible lock-in effect. And it is far more powerful than motivation or willpower. Because willpower tries to fight behavior. Identity justifies it. So even when you want to change, the old identity resists not through force, but through familiarity. This is why progress often feels uncomfortable at the beginning, not because the task is hard, but because it doesn't match who you've been acting like. And your system resists mismatch. A grounded real-life moment, you try to change a routine, but something inside feels unnatural. Not painful, just unfamiliar. So you drift back to what feels normal. That normal is not comfort. It is repetition. And repetition always wins over intention unless it is interrupted. So the real work is not becoming a new person instantly. It is interrupting the old identity loop long enough for a new pattern to stabilize. Without that interruption, nothing changes, even if your intentions do. Because identity always follows action, not aspiration. Do you want to continue to the next part? Yes or no? 4. Discipline is simply resistance you stopped obeying. Discipline is often misunderstood as control over action. But in reality, it is control over response. Specifically, your response to resistance. Every time resistance appears, hesitation, discomfort, urge to delay, you face a fork in behavior. One direction reinforces avoidance. The other weakens it. And whichever you repeat becomes your default reaction. Most people think disciplined people don't feel resistance. That's incorrect. They feel it, they just don't obey it. That difference is everything. A practical scenario, you sit down to do something important. You feel slightly restless. Your mind suggests something easier. If you follow that suggestion, you reinforce the pathway of escape. If you stay, even imperfectly, you weaken it. Nothing external changes in that moment. But internally, the structure of your response shifts. And that shift is what compounds. Over time, resistance stops being a command. It becomes background noise. But that only happens after repeated noncompliance with it. Here is the quiet truth most people miss. You are not building discipline through intensity. You are building it through repeated refusal to obey avoidance. And each refusal is small enough to feel insignificant in the moment, but powerful enough to reshape your baseline over time. So discipline is not a personality trait. It is a trained disagreement with your immediate impulses. And once that disagreement becomes consistent, your life starts following a different trajectory, not because circumstances changed, but because your response system did. Now the question is no longer about knowledge. It is about whether you are willing to stop treating resistance as authority. At this stage, the pattern is no longer hidden. It is visible in how decisions are made in real time, not in hindsight. And once a pattern becomes visible, it stops being an excuse and starts becoming responsibility. Nothing in your situation is being controlled by a single dramatic factor. It is being shaped by repetition, small, ordinary, almost invisible decisions that accumulate without emotional attention. That is why change rarely feels like a breakthrough. It feels like correction. Discipline is not a sudden transformation of behavior. It is the stabilization of direction. A repeated return to what matters, even when it does not feel important in the moment. Most people misinterpret this. They wait for intensity. They wait for a moment where everything clicks. But what actually matters is whether your behavior aligns with your intention when there is no pressure forcing it. That is the real test. Because pressure can temporarily produce discipline. But only identity can sustain it. And identity is built through behavior that repeats without negotiation. There is a simple structure underneath everything discussed so far. Behavior, repetition, identity, outcome. Not as theory, but as accumulation. Every time you delay something that matters, you are not just losing time. You are reinforcing a version of yourself that accepts delay as normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. That is how stagnation becomes stable. Not through failure, but through familiarity. At this point, responsibility becomes unavoidable, but not in an emotional sense. In a structural sense. Because if your repeated behavior created your current state, then waiting for external change is just another form of delay in a different form. This is where self-respect becomes relevant, not motivation. Self-respect is not how you feel about yourself. It is what you allow yourself to repeatedly do without correction. And discipline is the expression of that standard in action. There is a specific moment that defines everything, the moment where resistance appears and you either negotiate with it or interrupt it. That moment is not rare. It happens daily, often multiple times a day. And each time, it either reinforces your old pattern or weakens it. Nothing dramatic happens externally in that instant. But internally, you are either maintaining your current identity or shifting it slightly. And those shifts, repeated over time, become your life without announcing themselves. So the real issue is not capability. It is consistency under ordinary conditions. And the real question is not whether you understand this, but whether you will act differently in the exact moments where you usually don't. Nothing about your situation requires a different life. It requires a different response to the same life you already have. Because the conditions you are waiting for are not missing, they are being overridden by repetition. The same patterns, repeated often enough, become indistinguishable from reality itself. And that is the point most people miss. Your life doesn't change when you finally understand enough. It changes when you stop repeating what you already understand but ignore. There is no hidden insight left. No missing explanation that will suddenly unlock movement. What remains is the gap between recognition and execution, and that gap is filled only in ordinary moments where nothing feels significant. That is why discipline never announces itself. It does not feel like progress while it is happening. It feels like interruption of your usual pattern. But that interruption is the only place where direction actually changes. Everything else is continuation. So the real shift is not emotional. It is structural. Stop treating resistance as a signal to adjust, and start treating it as the exact point where your pattern is either preserved or broken. Nothing external needs to change first. The sequence begins internally, in small decisions that usually go unnoticed. And once those decisions shift consistently, everything built on top of them follows, not instantly, but inevitably. Not because life became different, but because you stopped repeating the version of yourself that kept it the same.